This slideshow gives us a brief introduction to the meaning of the term Indigenous people. And I asked the question, who are they? Because they seem to represent several different things that we have talked about, but yet they are unique in their own way. Indigenous people are ethnic groups, certainly, because they share a common cultural identity, and that while it's subjective, that identity forms the basis of who they are. They are also minority groups because they have experienced that situation in society that we've talked about in many examples, in which they are discriminated against. Their power has literally been taken away from them. But there's something else that we also talk about with Indigenous groups, which is similar again to groups that we saw in the term diaspora, that they identify with a particular geographic location. But one of the major differences that we will consider when looking at this is that these groups have been taken over by another group. They were in the particular geographic area first, but were taken over. In other words, their power and their land were taken from them by invading, or what we call today colonizing powers. The United Nations, while establishing something called the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples, does not give us an official definition of who these people are. Yet the United Nations declares that these people need protection, that their rights have been violated, and that these people, quote, are arguably among the most disadvantaged and vulnerable groups of people in the world, end quote. A list of Indigenous people is given in Wikipedia, of course. Wikipedia uses the definition of Douglas Sanders given in his article, Indigenous Peoples Issues of Definition, in the Journal of Cultural Property. He states, quote, these ethnic groups that were indigenous to a territory prior to being incorporated into a national state, and who are politically and culturally separate from the majority ethnic identity of the state that they are part of. This definition also adds the distinction to what I talked about earlier, that these people are, quote, determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and their ethnic identity, end quote, and that's from Wikipedia. Which could apply, again, to almost all ethnic groups, as we saw in the discussion of diaspora. So what parts do we build upon? They are indigenous, which means they are native to or were there first, that they were made part of another group's political unit, whether peacefully or not. They have maintained some parts of their distinct culture and are trying to maintain that sense of ethnic identity as close as possible to their original region to pass along to future generations. This definition to me seems to be the most comprehensive, but still sets these ethnic groups apart from others. The three Indigenous groups we will look at this semester are the Aborigine peoples of Canada, which includes the Inuit, the First Nations, and the Métis. The Hawaiians of the United States, this is the only group in the United States that at least I bring in to this particular class. Again, I think because it's a unique situation that sometimes we don't have time to examine in other discussions about ethnic groups in the United States. And then the third is the Brazilian natives. Each of these groups had their own experiences when their land were conquered or colonized by outsiders, but they also share many of the same experiences that are seen around the world in the situations for Indigenous people. The reason I picked the Canadian and the Brazilian is because we are examining the larger ethnicity and background of Canada and Brazil, and I just thought it was easier to pick up these groups at the same time. There are so many that we could have chosen, but it was more comprehensive to do this. As we will see looking at these three groups, a pattern starts to emerge from the stories. As they first encounter people from Europe and these three different nations of the New World, because that's what we're basically looking at. First, there seems to be some attempt to work together in trading goods and learning about each other, because obviously the native people, if friendly, offer a great deal of information to these people coming from Europe because they are used to living in the same area. So first there's an attempt to work together. The next step occurs when land or natural resources become the most valuable commodities, often when land is needed by the settlers for farming rather than the explorers or traders who are just passing through. At this point, it seems that the indigenous people are pushed off their land. When the indigenous people start to fight back or start to say enough, the Europeans then decide to get rid of them either by genocide, which of course we have seen in many of these countries, even in the United States, the idea that it's okay to kill these people because they're standing in our way. The indigenous people remaining are told they must assimilate for their own good. They must accept this larger dominant culture that is coming to take them over. When that doesn't work, the indigenous people are forced onto limited areas of territory where many of them remain today. Today we're seeing another part of this pattern that, at least to me, seems to be obvious, and that's most groups today are fighting to maintain their cultures, restore missing languages, and find a way to continue their culture. Sometimes that's social movements. Also, the groups protest for their rights or the enforcement of treaties that have been previously made. We particularly see that in the United States, where treaties were made with the Native Americans, but as soon as we made them, we broke them. And so some groups have gone to court. A particularly interesting example is in the Northeast, in the area that is Maine, the state of Maine, where they actually won. The Native American tribe there won in court the right to their original treaty, which would have pushed everybody out of Portland, Maine. But of course, there were some compromises made involving a lot of money. So right now, that group in New England is probably one of the richest of the Native American tribes. Here, I've just briefly shown or stated the goal of most of the social movements that we've seen. Restore land taken away, restore missing language, which is extremely important. We talked very early in the semester about the importance of language to a culture, that it has certain ways of looking at things. It's a certain mentality, which is more important than I think we really realize until we look at it carefully. And then again, to maintain the culture and pass it along to their children. And just to briefly summarize, we have a definition that includes several parts. They were there first, but become part of another group's political unit. They have maintained some parts of their distinct culture, and today are trying to maintain that sense of identity in a region as close as possible to their original land or region of a country. A pattern of relations between the indigenous groups and the invading dominant groups has emerged. It is one that I have outlined. Today we see social movements emerging from these groups to restore lost parts, usually an emphasis on land and language, to pass along to future generations.